Hi, everyone. I'm Barb Egan with Therapy Talks. And on today's show, we have Paige Matheson, a former psychiatric nurse who was a nurse throughout the COVID pandemic, who is now is a registered clinical counselor. So she is a therapist. We have her on to share about her experience, what made her switch careers and go into therapy, as well as what it's been like working with university students throughout the pandemic. What are they struggling with? What are their strengths? And we highlight a lot about strength based and positive psychology and even what that could mean for you. So Paige was one of our interns. So on one of the calls, we had Dr. Ed Weiss. So him and myself are clinical supervisors with Third Space Charity and University of British Columbia. Paige was one of our interns. She's a clinical counselor, all licensed up now. She's fantastic. But before that, her story, psychiatric nursing. Like what a time to be a nurse, specifically a psych nurse. And so we're so excited to have you on, share your story, kind of why counseling, why now, and then even sharing a little bit about what you've seen, because we've just spent this whole last year amidst the pandemic working with university age students and just what it's like to walk with them right now and their mental health. So we're so excited to have you on. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been a psych nurse, since 2009, actually. And interestingly enough, I have had a passion for mental health since I was in grade 9. I did a job shadow at a psychiatric facility and was like hooked. And so I went directly into psychiatric nursing. So I have a Bachelor of Arts in Psych Nursing from Brandon University. And I was in the field in Manitoba for 7 years before moving out to beautiful British Columbia, and have been based in Kelowna. But all of my areas of work were the emergency department, acute psychiatry, intensive psychiatry, and then also an assessment program and substance use connections. So I have a little bit of everything except child and youth, basically, as my background in psych.
So, Paige, that's amazing. For our listeners, like, what does that all mean? What does that look like in real life?
Yeah, for sure. So if you were to think about a nurse, you think about like medications, you think about just kind of treating different physical illnesses. But with psychiatric nurses, we're also treating the physical illnesses that pop up for people. But we also are looking at all of the different types of mental illnesses that come forward. So depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar mood disorder, any of the personality disorders. We're the full spectrum of mental illness that we work with. But typically, the people we're working with in a hospital setting are at a point of crisis. So whether they recognize that they're at crisis point and experiencing thoughts of suicide or realizing they need to come in for help, or in a space where they might not actually recognize that they are at a point where they need the additional assistance, and sometimes have to come in as involuntary patients at that time, where we try to protect their rights as much as we can and give them as many comforts as we can. But of course, if a person's in danger, then we have to protect them. Unfortunately, the words against their will sucks, but that's kind of the reality of it.
So, Paige, you were young when you did that job shadow. What was it about psychiatric nursing that really hit you at that age?
I was just fascinated that the human brain could go into the directions that it could go into. I, at a very young age, had spent a lot of time with other kids who had issues with their mental health. And I remember them saying that they had went to a psychiatric facility in their teens and being like, ugh, my psych nurses sucked. And I thought, you mean I don't have to become a psychologist to work with mental health? This is great. So that's the direction I went. But I always just thought, it's so fascinating that our brains can just go in directions that I could not even make up, like, especially when a person is in extreme psychosis. It's just truly unbelievable what our brains will tell us is real.
So, for most of us, like we won't experience that even firsthand or see someone. What is that like? Psychosis. Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, you're almost in like an altered universe to a certain degree, where the very most common thoughts that feel a little unusual are, the very first is religious thoughts, where you believe that you are a religious entity, or hallucinations where you feel that God is speaking to you, but it's like a very distinct voice or like whispers. The other ones are paranoia or being grandiose, or also known as like a very elevated sense of self, where you think you have access to millions or billions of dollars and do a lot of incredibly uh, bad spending at the time. So yeah, to describe psychosis, it's so hard because there's such a variety among every single person who comes through our doors. And it's really hard to sometimes see, especially after being in a counseling role and working more with people who are not at a crisis point, and working with people in the hospital where they have no capability of recognizing the difference between what's reality and what is not. And in those moments, it can be really hard because they also have a fight or flight response. I'm saying to them, you need to stay in hospital. Something is wrong. Someone is worried about you. And they're like, nothing is wrong with me. You're crazy. Get out of my face.
Oh, right. Wow. So what has it been like? Because you're shifting gears now, but what has it been like being in a master's of counseling psychology and being a nurse, being a psychiatric nurse throughout the pandemic? What has that been like?
It's so funny because I started my master's right before the pandemic hit. And so I already knew that I was wanting to shift gears because I was finding that the role of being a nurse, there's so many more higher expectations of like what the quality of care we can provide, plus all of the new paperwork that comes forward, plus all the new medications we have to learn. Like there's just so many little bits and pieces that have changed since I first started being a nurse. And I realized I was enjoying counseling my coworkers more than I was like enjoying the actual nursing activities.
Right.
And so that's why I kind of drifted into that direction. But during the pandemic, I was actually off for most of 2020 after a workplace incident. And so that was a blessing in disguise that I didn't even realize at the time because it happened in January of 2020. Wow. But when I returned, I really noticed that staff morale had significantly declined. We, of course, lost certain coworkers due to the vaccine mandates. And that also added to more short staffing. And it just makes it really hard to feel motivated to go to your workspace when you know that there's an increasing anxiety and you know that your coworkers are hurting and you know that people are starting to look into other avenues. And they look at me being like, you're almost out of there, girl. Like, you're going to be a counselor. Right. And I'm like, yes. But at the same time, I'm really going to miss my colleagues and those connections because there's just such a different type of team environment associated with that versus what it feels like as an individual counselor.
Right. And I see so many nurses, primarily for work balance, work stress, life balance. Burnout is probably the number one issue associated with nurses, burnout. This was before the pandemic.
Yes.
And I could only imagine like what a ray of light that you could be of just empathy, validating what they're experiencing. I mean, that would be really invaluable for providing care there, just as a colleague there. And what kind of motivated you to, shift those gears and go into counseling, to leave psychiatric nursing and to say, Kate, I'm going to make this big change?
Yeah, I had always kind of had it on the back burner of something I kind of wondered. I even felt that way in Manitoba, because even at that time, it was right before the opioid crisis hit. And it was right before meth became very popular as a street drug. And so already at that point, I was like, I'm kind of wondering if I like the counseling piece of my nursing role more than the actual being a nurse part. And I'd reached out to a couple of old professors to ask like what they recommended for like schooling. And they just said, well, just do a master's in psych nursing. I'm like, I have no desire in doing that. So when I moved to Kelowna, I thought, maybe it's just the change of scenery that I need. And I quickly noticed, I'm like, it was not the change of scenery. It was the job role. So I bounced around to a few different places, but unfortunately I still never felt that it was suiting me enough. So then I was like, it's time to look into schooling, and that's the direction I went.
Yeah. And then share about your internship. We loved having you. You're amazing. And what it was like serving university age students. So our demographic for the internship, we served 18 to 30-year-old students, that university age demographic. What has that been like, counseling them, caring for their mental health throughout the pandemic?
Their university experience is incredibly different than mine was when I was back in the day. And it's one thing that it's like, okay, look, you get all this opportunity to focus on your studies, but there is such a huge developmental piece of the socialization associated with like your first few years living outside of your parents' home. And so many of my clients, and I know of a lot of young people who are still having to live with their parents because of COVID, or they were just doing distance education. So the cost efficiency just seemed to make more sense. And I'm just so worried it's going to set that age group back developmentally when it comes to socialization, making the mistakes you make as a university student, where we have more forgiveness for some of the things that happen when people are overly intoxicated or whatever kind of mistakes they make in their university careers. So it's just so much different. It's so much different.
Oh, it's so different. I mean, I've worked with university students for like 14 years in the United States and Canada. And I mean, just working on their campuses, working with student athletes and coaching staff and professors there, and with graduate students, it has been a unique 2 years. Like their experience the last 2 years has been entirely different than anyone before them and probably after them. And it's going to really impact them. I know that at one point we gave a talk at the university saying, developmentally wise, we're seeing that 21 is the new 14.
Yeah.
Like that
Yeah.
their age says 21, but emotional maturity wise, life skills, they're more like 14-year-olds. And again, this was right before the pandemic. This was the age of screenagers. There was a film put out by a pediatrician in the United States that toured across the world. And we spoke on this panel on how screens and mental health of teenagers and university age students, and the identity formation, the increase of anxiety, stress, depression. And then COVID hits, isolation hits. And what did you see the most of that students would come and speak to you about?
Lots of anxiety. And you know what's so interesting, and it is interesting and scary at the same time, is the majority of my clients never brought up COVID, that COVID was never one of their main stressors. And when I talk to people 30 plus, that's what a lot of people talk about, is the stress related to COVID. But it's almost as though these young people just, it just came into their life. They adjusted in a way that was very natural in comparison to us who have been outside of the world of phones and technology a lot more. So I thought, okay, well, good, they're transitioning, but are they going to know what it's like in a different type of world, even though in their really little years or their years before university, it wasn't COVID. So it's just so interesting. It blew my mind when hardly anyone spoke about COVID.
Wow. Wow. What did you feel like was their biggest stressors or anxiety triggers that you were seeing?
There was a lot of people who were concerned about procrastination. You had mentioned the word identity, just having this crisis of identity, not only just because you're a university student or a person who's in that age category, but like suddenly you're navigating your entire future. And that's what I actually quite liked about that age group. There's so much more hope and optimism and the willingness to change, because that natural burnout that can happen to us as we age hasn't set in yet. They're like, okay, that's a great suggestion, or I don't know if that'll work, but I can do this. And there's a bit more of this optimism or excitement, even in the clients I was working with who had quite a bit of depression.
It's so true, because like as we get older and more life experience or more doubt, more skepticism, it's like, oh, well, I've tried that. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
But at that age, they're like, oh, I'm on my own, independence. Okay, I'll try that. I could try that if I wanted to. And I think there's a really beautiful like greenness and eagerness about that age.
Totally. I watched a very funny TikTok the other day where the girl's like, don't you hate it when your counselor is right and was talking about all of these very simple things that her counselor had suggested for her in her life. And she's like, I did these things and they worked. But she was, of course, in her younger 20s. And so it's so much harder to implement new things too in your 40s, especially if you tried it once or twice, when the reality is habit forming takes nearly 90 days versus the 21 that was magically made up at one point.
Right, right. I think it was a Sandra Bullock movie. It was like 28 days or something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I believe it.
Okay, so when you're walking with students through anxiety that they're finding and maybe some identity formation and what that looks like, what would you do? Like, how would you meet them where they're at? How would you walk with them?
So I am very positive psychology based. I am all about finding someone's strengths, building on those strengths, and then helping them develop a sense of meaning in their world based on those natural capabilities that they have that they might not even realize they have. So would typically do a character strengths survey with them, and we could then start to personalize, like, what are the things that are actually going to give you a sense of purpose? What are the things that are going to give you a sense of joy, bring you more positive emotions, better your relationships? And then also you could start making goals from those strengths to then get that sense of achievement. And all of those bits and pieces are all about the reaching well-being based on research from Martin Seligman.
Oh, Paige, I love that. I love strength-based. I love positive psychology because it's like people don't come to counseling just to unpack everything bad in their life. Like
Totally.
we do need to validate that. Do need to give words to that and maybe reframe them when needed. Have a safe space, yes, but we can't just sit in it and dwell in the negative. And that's what so many people's perception of therapy is I don't want to go just talk about my problems. I just
Totally.
don't want to go talk about all the negative in my life. That just makes me feel terrible. So, could you give us an example of what that positive psychology looks like, where it comes from? Like, what are some strategies? Even an example of what you just gave, like what a character strength and finding some things to find joy in.
Totally. If I go based on one of my character strengths, it's humor. And as a stand-up comedian, that did not shock me at all when that strength came up. But it was like, okay, so how can I put humor in all of these different categories of well-being? So for positive emotions, laughter is going to bring that. I could do like relationships, going and laughing with other people, doing the stand-up comedy. That's also something that helps with that. Finding meaning. I find purpose and meaning in being able to bring laughter to other people. And it's a sense of achievement. And so all of those elements of positive psychology still could go back to humor. But what another one of my strengths is curiosity, which is why counseling is so up my alley. I'm so curious to know about other people, and I get joy from learning about other people and all those kind of things. So I was able to look at, okay, so this is definitely going to give me a sense of meaning and purpose. I'm going to feel a sense of achievement when I connect with people on a curiosity level. And so when you find those strengths, you can definitely start finding ways to implement them in your lives in multiple ways.
Oh, I love that. It's so personal and it's so practical. Like you could actually put it into your real life.
100%. And is how you can develop your personalized self-care, your personalized goals. And if you don't resonate, out of all of the people I've ever had do that quiz, I've only had one person come back that were like, nah, didn't really work for me. And they were right. When they read their strengths, it was not them at all. And so that was fascinating. But it is a research-based quiz, the one that I would send out to people.
What tool do you use?
Is called the VIA Character Strength Survey. I'm completely blanking on what the VIA stands for, but you just do a quick Google search, and yeah, they do research based on what your results are as well.
Is it free?
It's free. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. It's very cool.
Oh, I've got to look into that. So for our listeners, you could go and check that out. Like, see what your unique strengths are. I think that would be so neat. So how many strengths does it compute?
It tells you from 1 to 24, so your top all the way to the bottom. And so their research shows that there's 24 character strengths that we have. And so yeah, top to bottom, it will tell you. And I liked looking at my my weaknesses. I can't remember what they were at this point, which I mean, obviously I just was like, meh, not relevant.
Yeah.
But it is kind of cool when my clients would look at it too. They're like, yes, absolutely, that's an area I struggle in. I'm like, well, is that something you want to work on? Because obviously if it's not naturally coming to you, then it does make it harder if that's one of your goals, to change one of those characteristics or traits.
Right, right. Oh, I'll have to look into that. We use the Gallup Strength Finders quite a bit,
Yeah.
which is another research based. It's used by like 90% of the Fortune 500 companies. Pre-COVID, we would go into these huge organizations, huge companies, and do it for their staff, their team, and debrief and how they could work together as a team. It computes, I think it's 36 of the unique strengths, and it computes your top five. And the chances of you having the same top five in that order as someone else is like 1 in 25 million people. Like, you're so created on purpose for a purpose. It is so encouraging. And you hear this type of approach to therapy, to this positive psychology or strength-based psychology, and you're like, who doesn't want to know what they're good at? Who doesn't know what makes them unique? Even if you're doing relatively quote unquote well in life, yeah, it could benefit you. It just like enhances the flavor a little bit. But again, when you're feeling low, like that was a strategy I used when I was personally in counseling years ago, was I did that strength finder, and it actually helped me like myself again. Like,
Amazing.
I could not see past my own pain, couldn't see past those negative thought cycles, the inner critic in me. And I would never on my own come up just on, oh, these are my top five strengths, or these are the top things I'm grateful for. I would have such a hard time with that. But having a tool like that, a quiz that you could do, and then it computes it, and then you have someone to debrief it with and say, okay, where have you seen this in your life? Where do you see it in your life? And then where could you see it? Like your goals, you were saying. Oh, I love that.
Oh, yes. And you mentioned about when you're in like a low space. When I was reading about positive psychology, I was so incredibly amazed that the actual, like, that it's very beneficial for depression. And I thought, this is really cool, because the first thing you think of with depression is like this lack of meaning or lack of purpose, or like this lack of positive feeling. And of course, it won't help with someone who's at a point where they might need medication or electroconvulsive therapy, or something to like that extent of depression. But if you're at like mild to moderate, and you even if you ebb and flow in that space, yeah, it can be really life changing.
Anybody could benefit from a tool like that, a strength finding tool, whether you're an empty nester, going through a life transition, getting married, doing it with couples. I've done it with them to kind of just spur one another on, becoming a parent, changing careers. But if you zone into that university age, like, who am I? What am I good at? What would I want to do with the rest of my life? That's overwhelming. What a powerful tool, and someone to walk alongside of you to help guide you in that. That would be a really strategic tool at that period of time in their life.
And it was fun. And of course, I didn't get to do it with them, but I was always so excited to hear their results. And it was probably one of the most actually utilized homework that I provided out of any of the things I had suggested. That was the tool that was used the most, for sure, consistently.
So what are some of the maybe the most prevalent maybe character strengths that you'd see, like besides humor? What would be another example that maybe your average university student would see and then could implement in their life?
Oh, I'm trying to think. Everyone's results were so different. I think it's quite similar to the test that you were talking about, that there weren't a lot of super common ones. Love of learning, that one was pretty common. Perseverance, and I was like, yes, perseverance, you got this. And so those were probably the top two that I would see frequently. But the love of learning was great, because especially when they were university students, I was like, so good. So how can we make the learning fun again for you, inside of all of the things that are necessary to learn right now?
So if you saw a student like some anxiety, that procrastination, like you said, is a big one, how would you help them overcome procrastination? And I mean, that's a great life skill, whether it's cleaning your house or applying for a job or in the workplace, what would be some tools that you'd implement for that?
Well, it's so funny because like procrastination can come from a couple different spaces. It can be A, you're too overwhelmed to be able to find that energy within the moment to actually work on the thing you need to. But there's also a bit of an element of self sabotage, which is a completely unconscious thing inside of us where either there's like a piece of us that makes it hard for us to believe that we can achieve something or that we're capable, and we're afraid of disappointing ourselves, so we just leave it to the bare bones last minute. So that, I mean, if I get a crappy grade, well, it's because I procrastinated. So it almost becomes like this internalized thing that sometimes people don't even know is happening. So talking about self-sabotage and talking about how can we actually reduce your anxiety by adding some fun elements, making legitimate breaks, and giving them research about why breaks work, how they will propel you forward later, and really kind of helping change that negative narrative of like, I need to get this done, I need to get this done now, or I'm never going to get this done if I work on it now, so may as well wait until the last minute kind of thing.
Right, kind of the all night cramming. So, what would be some examples of breaks that you guys would work through and just try to find for university students for procrastination? Again, this could be applicable to us adults in work, though, too. We all procrastinate in something. What would be some break ideas?
I just said schedule it. I said schedule your breaks, and then you can either utilize different self care activities that you came up with from your strengths. But I also use the love languages quiz quite a bit as well, because you can know a lot about yourself and how you give others love or want to be loved. But we can also use those tools on how we can develop, how can I give myself love? Like, what are some things I can do that make me feel good, that come from my love language? So we would just look at their love languages and their strengths, what's going to make them feel rested and what's going to recharge them, what's going to get them engaged in something that they're going to enjoy. Rock climbing, hiking, especially if they can get outdoors. If it just took them 5 minutes to go snuggle their cat, whatever things are going to be feeling either restful or recharging, just make a list of things that take 5 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes a day. And then they could just pick and choose without any thinking after they've made their list.
Yeah. So for our listeners, that would be a great take home. Like make a list of what's restful, what's recharging. And I love how you broke it down. Like sometimes you're only going to have 5 minutes.
Yeah.
What could you do during those? Like keep it on your phone or keep it handy so you don't have to think of it on the spot when your brain's already going in stress mode. You already have it planned out 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes. That would be so great, like so proactive. And you're so right. I love the love languages. I use them with couples and parents all the time, but individually, if we can't love ourselves, how could we love anybody else? If we can't be
Yes.
present with ourselves, if we can't pour back into ourselves, how can we do that with anybody else?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And if we're pouring all of our energy into our education, which is exactly what students are supposed to be thinking, or as adults, pouring our entire world into our work or being a parent or into whatever avenues take up a big chunk of our time, we're not rejuvenating, we're not filling our cup. And if we don't fill our cup, we get burnt out. Things don't feel like the things that did bring us joy in our work worlds, in our parent worlds, whatever it looks like, feels like a chore versus the enjoyment or like the enjoyable bits and pieces of all of those things.
Oh, wow. What an interesting time. I mean, to work in mental health care, to be a therapist, but primarily university students, like just coming out of a year of working with them amidst the pandemic. And has there been anything else that you were, shocked by or surprised by working with university students or learned from your experience there?
One of the things that I learned pretty quickly, and I wasn't necessarily shocked, but it was very intriguing, how much trauma people have really experienced and how we're redefining trauma in comparison to back in the day where it's like had to be a near death experience or a sexual assault. Well, now we're looking at neglect. What were some like micro things that happened in your life that were life changing, or like messages that kept being passed along year after year that you just really internalized, and then you grow that self critic, And a lot of times that comes from a traumatic space where you're second guessing and questioning, and your fight or flight is always activated, or something happens, you're like, why am I so anxious about this? Nothing really bad happened, but it can be so associated with past things that we've experienced or the messages we've learned. So it was really cool working with people, not because I'm not a trauma therapist, but working with them to kind of find, okay, let's gain some awareness as to why this reaction is happening. Now, what can we do to kind of continue to move forward so that you can grow in ways that you didn't think were possible, so that then later you feel like you're ready to go to trauma therapy when that time comes.
Do you think that this age group is just more open to mental health care, to therapy? Like it's just more normal and accepted to them?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's, if someone is having a crisis in their 20s, because I mean, I work in an emergency department. So if someone's having a crisis in their younger years, they don't seem to be beating themselves up as much as the people 30 plus, which is so interesting because I know I beat myself up at points where I felt weak in my mental illness. But then after I gained that self compassion and really realized that humanness that's inside of me, it also helped me even develop so much more compassion for other people. So if people knew that if we could be compassionate with ourselves and our own mental illness, then that would grow into connecting with other people on a different level outside of that as well.
Oh, I love that you highlight the strengths of this age group too, because they often get such a bad rap of, always on the screens, not really, or entitled. Like you hear a lot of derogatory names around that age, and I love them. Like they're probably my favorite to work with, to be honest, for those reasons of, being motivated, wanting better for them, social justice warriors. Like they're really like big, compassionate hearts for others, and then helping them have that for themselves. Like, and I think it starts with really normalizing mental health care and taking care of yourself. Um, and that's so great. Like, what other strengths do you see about this age group?
Oh, goodness. Well, I'd mentioned the optimism of like that willingness to change. That's just more open to suggestion, I guess, that I really love. But they also are going to be having creative ideas that we never would have thought or expected, because they're coming across more information in their earlier years than I probably will ever come across in my lifetime, like through scrolling and like TikTok, especially the amount of information that is out there in the world, some of it, of course, false, but there's just so many new perspectives they get to learn, which then increases their empathy. I think they're going to be able to connect with humans in a really interesting way. And I think that's why we are having more social justice warriors, because people are more willing to learn without being defensive about things. They're not personalizing it. They're intrigued. They're curious. And I think that's what's happening in the younger generation more so than a lot of the older generations.
Oh, I love that. I so agree with that. I think there's this empathy, this openness, this compassion, that it's just really beautiful.
Yeah, I love when someone's like, I'm an empath. I'm like,
Yeah.
me too. Me
I know. And they
too.
use that word a lot. I was like, I would never know that at 18. I would never, or trauma informed, like just how they talk about trauma or, and I think to some extent we've all experienced some type of trauma in our life.
Mhm.
So the fact that you can be open about it and find your safe people and talk about it, because then that shame can't consume you, in the right
Yes.
spaces, in the right light, with the right safe people, it loses its power. So I think
Mhm.
there's a huge strength in that. Absolutely.
Big time. Oh, I love that age group. They're just it. I felt energized after a lot of sessions where I was just like, man, they're really optimistic, or even if optimistic is too big of a word, there was just a sense afterwards, like, okay, like I think they're going to be okay, which is a wonderful feeling, because you're like, okay, I feel and sense that willingness, that interest, that desire. It's there.
So, Paige, now that as a counselor, what do you really love to work in? Like, what is the area you're going after?
So I want to eventually really hone in on specializing on working with helpers. So that's nurses, physicians, counselors, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, anyone who's in a helping role, because there is still so much stigma in our world that we can't crumble. We can't fall. And if you do, you're either A, letting down your team, or B, you're incapable of being able to figure out your own stuff. And doesn't matter how much information you have, knowledge is actually not power. Implementation of knowledge, that's where the power is. So if we've fallen behind in being able to implement all these things that we need to do for ourselves because we're so busy caring for other people, we're going to falter. We're going to be at higher risk for secondary trauma and all of those kinds of things. And so I want to work with healthcare professionals, and I want to reduce the stigma of helpers asking for help.
Oh, I love that. I know one of my favorite quotes behind every good therapist is a good therapist. Like,
It's
and
perfect.
it's
Yes.
so true. So true. And that goes for physicians and nurses and all the helping professionals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've talked with multiple colleagues of mine who, being a person who's been a nurse too, and understands what does shift work looks like, what is working under a health authority, what is some of the helplessness associated with short staffing and those job roles. And they've said, like, man, I would want a therapist who truly has been in there. And I'm like, very cool, because that's exactly the understanding that I want to be able to present in that role, because then they don't have to explain it. There's no explanation required. I'm already feeling exactly what they're talking about.
Yeah, it's that unspoken bond that you can speak the same language.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different personalities in nursing, especially. And
Yeah.
so I love working with every single one of them.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, my ideal would be to really hone in on trauma therapy and then being able to specialize in really helping helpers just overall.
Oh, that's awesome. And where can our listeners find you and follow you? Do you have any social media or website or anything like that?
Yeah, on Instagram, you can find me at anotherchapter.ca. My website is www.anotherchapter.ca, and they both basically have all my info on them. So yeah, that's how you can find me.
Awesome. Awesome. Paige, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And we just really enjoyed having you on today.
Thank you so much, Barb.